How you doing? It's Andrew Austin of the FAR podcast. This is the vlog associated with the Freedom and Reason blog. You can read the blog at andrewaustin.blog, and there you'll find hundreds of essays. I'm over 400 essays now on various topics having to do with class, economics, culture, race, all of the big items that we should all be interested in particular class and economics. I want to come to you today to talk to you about how to think about politics, or if you don't like that tone, then how I think about politics. I have a sociology degree, a master's and a PhD, and I have two areas of specialization. I'm known in my work primarily for being a criminologist, law and society, criminal justice administration systems, and so forth. But my other area of specialization is international political economy, and there I study, big structures, institutions, and the way in which these affect and are affected by legal systems, political institutions, and so forth. And so when I do an analysis, I'm always very interested in looking at them from the standpoint of these big forces. When I'm doing that, one of the things that you have to be careful about is to not get too wrapped up in personalities, right? So what you'll see, and this is a very superficial way of understanding politics, you see this all the time out there, is the freak out over Donald Trump. This is what I want to talk to you about. It happens to be probably the best example one can use of a rather immature way of thinking about politics. Stephen K. Bannon is always talking about the ratio of signal to noise, right? And I'm not on the right. I'm politically on the left, Democratic, Republican, Libertarian, and those things. But I listen to a lot of people across the political spectrum. And Steve Bannon is a highly intelligent, knowledgeable, experienced, and so forth. So I listen to his arguments. And one of the things he goes on and on about is signal to the noise, or signal in the noise, right? And the only reason I'm really mentioning him is because I want to talk about, the signal and the noise. And a lot of people will hear that and they'll say, isn't that something Steve Bannon talks about? And the answer is yes, it is. In fact. So let me talk about what that means. So a lot of people out there on the left, and this is the new left, progressive side, the liberals, people who often identify themselves as liberal, and I have made great pains to distinguish between liberalism in its classical form and new liberalism as it emerges with progressivism. But a lot of people out there will say, oh my God, Donald Trump's a fascist. He's a horrible, horrible person. You ought to read his tweets. Look what Donald Trump said today. He said this, he said that, whatever. And that's the noise. Okay. So, Donald Trump is a businessman from Queens. He sees America in a certain ways. If you want to get into what his deeper beliefs are, which is, I think, is relevant, because that's why he, came to this, and if you will, it's sort of his calling as a politician, is he's an economic nationalist. He cares about America. He's a patriot, right? So he cares about the American economy. Now, yes, he's a selfish, narcissistic, or maybe self-interested, if you want to put it in a nice way. He's all those things. Businessmen are that way. Why is he patriotic? What does he see in that? Well, he sees in America a vehicle through which he can be successful. In other words, he became successful in this context, and it was America, and it was in an America in which it was possible. And that America, in his view, is understood in terms of economic nationalism, right? And so he's been this long time critic of China. He's never agreed with the globalist idea of integrating the American economy fully with the world economy, right? And so that's what really drives him. All the things that he tweets and says, and and when you watch these press conferences and you're like, what is he saying? This just sounds crazy. All of that's just noise, right? The signal in the noise is his deeper economic philosophy. Now, people who the world spins around left and right look at him and they say this is a right winger, and not only is he a right winger, but he's a nationalist, and that's very scary. And that's where people will say he's a fascist. But they haven't studied fascism. Donald Trump does not represent fascism. This is not fascist tendency. He's not even particularly authoritarian in his thinking. He is, in terms of personal morality, it believes that people pretty much do what they want to do. So, so putting left and right aside for a minute, other than to identify myself as squarely on the left, let me just say something very quickly about that. So I'm a Marxist. I'm not neo-Marxist. I'm not a new left person. I'm not into liberation theology, and I know what it is. I'm not really into it, but because I know what it is, with critical theory and all of that, with Mao Zedong thought and post-structuralism, postmodernism, and the latter Frankfurt School thinking. I'm not part of that. I'm Democratic, Republican, Libertarian, classical Marxist thinker, right? And so you would hear my arguments, and you would say, well, that sounds rather liberal, okay? And older liberalism was on the left, whereas right was conservative. So what is Donald Trump in that sense? Well, you have to think about these bifurcation points differently than just left and right. You have to think about the difference between, say, populism and progressivism. So, and we'll take Joe Biden, since he's the one who's going to be running against Trump, and we'll locate them along these different bifurcation points, and they tend to line up in a bigger bifurcation point, right? So we have these continuums. So we have the continuum of populism to progressivism, right? So progressives are what? They're technocrats, right? They've accepted corporate governance. They've accepted capitalism. What they're trying to do is manage the discontents of capitalism in order to legitimize capitalism. And these technocrats, these bureaucrats, they find their careers in these systems, right? And progressivism emerges, in the late 19th, early 20th century, and then becomes really the operating system, political, economic ideology, and legal framework, and policy framework, and regulatory framework coming out of World War II. Well, populism is different. Populism is about local democratic control. The populists were the people who were trying to fight against corporate power. Now, they could be small, capitalists. They could be liberal capitalists, right? This producerism, right? The idea that of the small businessman, the working classes and the socialist struggles, democratic socialism. We're talking small d, right? Those would be populist. So there's also this distinction then between the bureaucratic corporatist idea that lies along this progressive technocratic idea, and then democracy and republicanism, small d, small r, republicanism, which go along with populism. And if you want to know who the founding fathers were, they were, liberal, secularist. They were a democratic Republican. They were populist. That's who they were. Were they elite in some sense? Sure, right. They own businesses and plantations and all of that. So you have those bifurcations, so those continuums, right? So you have the continuum from democracy to bureaucratic corporatism. Bureaucratic corporatism ends in a form that's not unlike bureaucratic collectivisms of the Chinese Communist Party sort. It's a totalitarian endpoint, whereas the democracy runs in the opposite direction. And democracy at its extreme end is then going to be associated with libertarianism. So you have authoritarianism, libertarianism. You have, corporate bureaucratic power, and you have democracy, right? You have progressivism and technocracy, and you have populism, right? It's associated with democracy. And then you have the nationalism, globalism point. And globalism is associated with, and this is just the historical development of the system, with bureaucratic corporatism. So corporatist and globalist, the technocratic order transcends the republican machinery of the nation state, creates a world order, economic world order with all of these then global political, legal, regulatory frameworks. All of that lies on towards the authoritarian end of things. So when people like to extol the values of globalism, they're actually talking about really an authoritarian, totalitarian endpoint. So nationalism, and I'm talking specifically here about civic nationalism, is what's associated with small d democratic, small r republicanism, associated with libertarianism, right? Which can be left or right. These can be left or right. You can have socialism in the context of democratic republicanism and libertarianism and all those values that grow out of the Enlightenment. Or you can have a totalitarian socialism, state-run socialism. Okay. So these are huge, massive things that transcend personality. Donald Trump then is really a personification. The fact that he's called to this because of his patriotism and his economic nationalism makes him the person that's going to represent this personification, just as Boris Johnson, probably more reluctantly, was called forth by the working class demand, sick of the Labour Party selling them out, but the working class demand to finally make Brexit happen, right? So Brexit, passes in 2016. The administrative state stalls all those years that Trump comes to power in 2016. And these are whether Trump is a capitalist is beside the point. Frederick Engels, Marx's collaborator, was an industrialist. His family, the Engels family, were in fact transnational industrialists, and there was they ran plants in England and Manchester, clothing manufacturing, apparel plants, and so forth. But who was Engels' choice of comrades? He was on the side of the English working class and on the side of the working classes in the various countries. And this isn't to suggest at all that Trump, and those are socialist, communist, right? It's not at all to suggest that Trump is a socialist. Of course not. No, he's a capitalist. But you can see where you can have because don't forget, in the Communist Manifesto, they emphasized that the struggle between capitalism, between the capitalist and the worker, right, between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, that struggle is a nationalist struggle. It occurs on the national stage. Right, because when it's globalized, when the economic forces and political forces, legal forces have transcended the nation state, then they subvert the Republican machinery that the working class can use in order to improve its situation. So Trump, because he's an economic nationalist, is closer to the interests of the working class because his policies are going to benefit people on a national level. They're going to benefit the citizens of the nation state. Right. Whereas the globalists are going to want to, take production overseas. They're going to want to open the borders and allow people to come in. And that's very devastating. Both those processes, which are the two sides of globalization, right? Offshoring and immigration. Those are devastating to the working class. And so we don't pick. We live in a capitalist society. So you have to say, okay, we're definitely not going to be led by socialists. I mean, Bernie Sanders isn't a socialist. He calls himself a democratic socialist, but he's progressive. And a sheepdog, as we can clearly see, he's working hand in hand with the Biden campaign so that they can work out language that they can use in order to make it appear as if they represent the interest of the working class. So we're stuck with capitalists. In a capitalist economy, we're stuck with capitalist running things, and the question is, what kind of capitalist do you want? Do you want the globalist capitalist? Do you want somebody like Joe Biden, who's been working hand in hand with the Chinese Communist Party for decades, who's sold out the American worker, who's all about transnationalizing production? Is that who you want? That's not the capitalist you want. There's no way to struggle for. And not simply struggle for democratic socialism, but there's no way to actually be able to preserve the values that we want to preserve even on the other side of capitalism, right? We don't want an authoritarian, totalitarian socialism. We want liberal values of free speech and free thought and religious liberty, right? We want secularism. We want humanism. We want these things. So as awful as Trump sounds, the way that he speaks, and there are policies that he's going to have and positions he's going to take that, a Marxist couldn't agree with, of the two factions, it's the one that personifies most, not perfectly. You're not going to get that. It's the one that personifies most. Uh, Small d democratic, small r republicanism, civic nationalism, economic nationalism, right? Who's going to support, more of the classical liberalism, who's going to be a populist, right? That's the person who's going to be best for working people. And before the COVID-19 crisis, um, working people were benefiting. That wages for the lower working class were rising faster than wages throughout the class structure, and it was the working class that was benefiting. And particularly black and brown people. African Americans were benefiting tremendously. Why? Because of the restriction in immigration. When you open up the borders, that's bad for black people, right? And then when you're closing the borders down, when you're restricting immigration, the employers had to find somebody to work for them, and black people have opportunities. So they were not only seeing their unemployment dropping dramatically, they were also seeing their wages rise. And so whatever Trump says, of course you don't agree with a lot of what he says. You can't. It's obnoxious. He's a narcissist. As I've said, he's an egotistical New York City businessman. I mean, I used to be a tile and marble mechanic, and I worked around in rich homes in South Florida. I mean, you run across these types of people all the time. But that's not the question. That's a very immature way of thinking about politics. I don't like him. It doesn't. That's not what we're looking at. The question is, what direction do you want the country to go? Do you want it to go in a globalist direction, which is going to make it ever more difficult? Because what lies at the end of the globalist dream is the nightmare of corporatist neo-feudalism. Again, turning us into serfs. This is why you can have corporate bureaucratic, what Sheldon Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism. Why it can appear so much like the bureaucratic collectivism of the Chinese Communist Party. This isn't a conspiracy. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party isn't taking over the world. That's what they'd like to do. But what you're seeing is a convergence. You're seeing a convergence between these two logics. And that's a terrible direction. Remember, as Marx and Engels said in the Communist Manifesto, the struggle, the class struggle is a nationalist one. So what the populist, economic nationalist, direction that Trump is representing, that he's the personification of, that keeps the power closer to the working class. It keeps it in a national framework, not perfectly. This is a global economy. We've already gone way down the road, obviously, of globalization. But if you don't recognize that, if you don't recognize that's what we're going for, then I want to invite you to, again, read my blog, read the analyses that I've been doing now for quite a long time on denationalization, on globalization, on these forces that stand against the working class, right? And does this mean you vote for Trump? I want to close with this. Does this mean you vote for Trump? I would not. I at this point, I'm not voting for Trump. Because there's sort of two things with this who you vote for. People say, well, it's the lesser of two evils, so you have to vote. So, and the assumption then is that you have to vote for Biden because if you don't, Donald Trump gets in. Well, there's two hurdles you have to get over. The first is that you have to believe that lesser of two evils is a viable strategy. I'm one person. This is a very large country. The state that I'm in is not a massive state, but it has millions of people in it. And so, what kind of effect does my vote have? Can I use my vote strategically to vote for the lesser of two evils? Right. Well, I don't buy that. I just, as a social scientist who understands statistics and probability and so forth, I just don't buy it. Now, could I persuade thousands and thousands of people to vote the way I want, have an effect? That would be giving myself way too much credit. I'm not, I don't ego trip in that way to think that what I say is going to affect many people, right? that would be great, but it's not going to happen. So people can relax about that. So it's absurd to say, oh, if you vote for if you don't vote for Biden, you vote for Trump. No, it means if I don't vote for either one, I don't vote for either one. If I vote for somebody else, I vote for that person. If I don't vote at all, I don't vote at all. Those are the choices. But even if you were to believe that you could use your vote strategically, the next thing you have to ask yourself is who's actually the lesser of two evils? Now, Trump sounds bad. People don't like it. He's on the right and he's a conservative, although not really. He's a liberal. But, but people say he certainly has formed a coalition with conservatives, right? So and he talks about God and the the conservative Christians like him, although that's not completely true, and it's certainly not completely true the Republicans like him. The establishment Republicans don't, and they've launched this massive effort to try to derail his presidency, which tells you a lot about the hegemonic power and the establishment and what they want. They want these Republicans, the Bush Republicans, they want to get back. They want to get back in, not them personally in power, but they want to get their globalist, neoliberal, neoconservative agenda, which they got from the Democrats, from the liberals, the Cold War liberals in the period after the 1960s. They're the neoliberals. They're the neoconservatives. So that's the establishment. The establishment isn't broken up along left or right or Democrat or Republican as if Democrats are on the left. That's not the way that works. That's not the actual dynamic. What it really is against the progressives, the globalists, the neoconservatives, the neoliberals, and all that on one side, and then the populists. It's amazing that Trump can get elected. I didn't think he would. Right up until election night, I thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. It was shocking to see. It turns out that economic nationalism is very appealing to the working class. And so millions of working people walked into the voting booth and they voted for Donald Trump. Why? Because they heard his message, not by what he said. They saw in him an ability to try to stop this runaway globalization and the destruction of their livelihoods. People get it at that level. And that's why Joe Biden is starting to adopt the America First rhetoric. He's actually plagiarizing not just Donald Trump, but he's plagiarizing the arguments of Stephen Bannon. It's really quite amazing. So they're listening. They're listening to Stephen K. Bannon's, War Room Pandemic podcast. They're listening to it because he's sort of talking about, they won. It was Bannon who was masterminding Trump's victory along with Trump, because Trump's a really smart guy. You better learn that if you want to try to understand what's going on. In fact, that whole noise part of the signal in the noise, that whole noise part is strategic on his part. It gets everybody talking about that, not paying attention to what he's doing, because he realizes that the establishment and the media, the academia, the administrative state, the culture industry, they're all marshaled against him. And these are the globalizers. These are the people who've been, screwing over the working class for the past several decades. Just think about the direction this country's been on. Look at who has taken us in that direction. And look at, Barack Obama, the Clintons, the Bushes, and even going back into the 1960s with Kennedy and Johnson, and the whole globalization push. Anyway, I wanted to explain that because I'm sure, and I don't even want to say this because I do admire people and I do have some faith in the ability of people to reason. But I just see so much on the internet of people who are just obsessed with Trump and the things that he says and the superficial read on what he says and no deep analysis like I just gave you. I just gave you the analysis of the way the world works. They don't think on those levels at all. And so when I say, am I going to vote for Trump? No, I'm not at this point. No, I'm not going to vote for Biden. I'm going to look and see if there's a third party I can vote for. It's quite likely that I'll wind up not voting for president if I can't find somebody that I vote for, because I vote based on aspirations. I vote for the person who's going to represent my values. And my values aren't just the economic values. They have to do with liberty. They have to do with democracy. They have to do with secularism. They have to do with reason and science and these things that are important to me. And so it's a big decision, but it's really it's a personal decision. It's a decision based on conscience. It's not a strategic decision. It's based on what you want to see. But for those who are telling you that you have to vote for Biden because Trump is this great disaster and that that lesser of two evils is viable, and we're going to presuppose who's the lesser of two evils, they're wrong on both accounts. Biden is not the lesser of the two evils. Biden represents the worst direction possible. We're kind of at a now, let me be very clear. We're at a turning point in history. We are. And we're going to either preserve the republic and the grounds upon which we can build a more democratic society, or we're going to see the emergence of a global neo-feudalism in which we will all essentially be serfs, and we will be directed by corporations, not only in political decisions, but in the way that we think, the way that we talk and act. These are very powerful forces we're up against. So you have to make a choice of comrades. The most important thing is to not do anything that would contribute to that direction. And so I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but I am going to tell you, I'm going to lay it out in those terms. And I look forward to hearing from you. So I want you to be courageous. I want you to keep up your spirits. I'm an optimistic person, even if what I said doesn't, it sounds rather pessimistic, doesn't sound optimistic. And I want you to think scientifically. That's so important for you to do. Listen to lots of different opinions, read arguments, educate yourself about how to understand facts. Don't be duped. Don't operate on the basis of confirmation bias. So don't say, oh, I agree with this, so let me collect all these things. If I don't agree with those, so I'll just ignore those. Pay particular attention to the things that you think you disagree with. Okay? Until then, which is the next time I'll see you, I want you to have a great rest of the day.